Conscient Podcast, Episode 156. Art historian, curator, and organizer, Siobhan, Angus.
I mean, I do think that that's what the arts contribute to these discussions. There's that possibility of that kind of emotional or embodied connection to things that, and I mean, even as I think these questions of climate and environment come closer and closer to people's lives, right? We can think of the wildfire smoke here last summer, people experiencing, flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, drought in real time. But I think through storytelling or sound or visual media, we can really feel that on an embodied level. And I think that that is a really powerful starting point to action.
I first heard about Siobhan Angus through a Carleton University Climate Commons Noon for Now event on January 18th, 2024, called Shifting Perceptions, Arts-Based Approaches to Climate Justice. I unfortunately was not able to attend, but I was intrigued by the questions that this session was exploring, including how do the arts contribute to climate justice? And how can art and artists reshape our perception of the world, helping us to collectively undertake the necessary actions to create a world worth living in? A world worth living in seems like a reasonable goal, doesn't it? How can something as ephemeral as art help with that? So I contacted Siobhan, and she kindly agreed to have a conversation with me about her work and some of the issues raised at this session. Dr. Angus lives here in the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin nations, also known as Ottawa, and is an assistant professor of media studies at Carleton University, where she teaches courses in visual culture studies and the environmental humanities, with a focus on collection-based research and experiential learning. Siobhan comes from a family of social activists and specializes in the history of photography and the environmental humanities. Her current research explores the visual culture of resource extraction with a focus on materiality, labor, and environmental justice. Her new book, Camera Geologica, An Elemental History of Photography, published by Duke University Press, will be available during the spring of 2024. It's nice to meet you, Siobhan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So we just met a few minutes ago, and I've been reading about your work, and I look forward to your book. But you're, somebody who's working in a similar field to me, interested in art and climate and environmental issues. So why don't you start just by talking about your background, where you come from, how you got into art, that kind of thing, and then we'll get into your work, your research, and talk about the role of art. But first of all, we need to know who you are.
Well, thank you for that. I guess in some ways, in some ways very obvious, in some ways sort of complicated. I've always been very interested in art, a visual person. I studied art history in my undergraduate work and, just always, really believed in the role of art in society and the role of art in social change. But my family, I come from a family that has a strong activist background. And so, had a lot of exposure, I guess, to what I would now call environmental justice struggles. And throughout my 20s, was very active in political organizing, really coming out of, I guess, an eco-socialist sort of movement. And then, at a certain point, though, sort of realized that some of the questions I was trying to answer were hard to answer in a sort of political economy framework or something very narrow. And so kind of returned to art and the work of artists as a way of kind of going back into those kind of questions of equity and justice and climate justice in a new way. And so I decided to do my PhD and sort of thinking about sort of merging art and ecology as a way of thinking through maybe some new pathways into thinking about climate activism or climate justice.
So being raised in a family of activists, one assumes that was a normal thing. This is what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that sort of exposure to kind of different sites of environmental harm. I was born in South Riverdale near a lead smelter. And it was the sort of site of a very early citizen science campaign where people in the neighborhood mobilized. They gathered medical data to prove that lead emissions from the factory were kind of causing environmental harms in the neighborhood. And I think being Canadian as well, my work really focuses on resource extraction and the sort of, environmental and health impacts that come with sort of removing metals from the earth and refining them. And extraction is so central to Canadian history, to Canadian economies. Also a sort of family connection. My dad's family sort of came from Timmins, one of the biggest gold producers in history. Both of his grandparents worked underground. And so there was these sort of, threads that were sort of coming together that led me to these questions. But it seemed like approaching them through the work of artists and thinking about the sort of possibilities of art in that context might open up some new ways of thinking through it.
Now you're teaching at Carleton some of these issues to young minds. How is that going?
It's fantastic. I think it's inspiring to see how much more expansive young people are in the way that they think about sort of climate or environment. I think even growing up for me, it took me a long time to sort of make some of the connections between environmental issues and these other questions of social justice and equity and environmental racism and that kind of like longer historical work. And I find my students are so quick to make those kind of connections. They can really understand the links between environmental issues and the sort of larger structural forces that have created the conditions for crisis in the present moment. And so that's something that I find very inspiring, and I'm always learning from them in that way, which is the best thing one can ask for as a teacher.
So can you give an example of a class that you're teaching that combines art and environment?
Yeah, right now I'm teaching a class on environmental communication. And at Carleton, I teach in the Communication and Media Studies program, but I'm trained as an art historian. But I teach their classes in visual culture. But a lot of our students, they're sort of training to go into the world as communications professionals. And so I've taught variations on this class that emphasized, more of the work of artists, right? Kind of going deeper into like art historical questions about form or lineage or genealogies, but really trying to enable my students, to kind of talk to people who are doing the work of environmental storytelling or kind of working through these complex questions of, say, environmental justice in sort of, we'll say, more creative forms as a way of reaching other audiences. In a couple of weeks, John Valiant, who wrote Fire Weather, is coming to our class to talk about sort of storytelling as a way of conveying these really complex questions of science, right? The sort of science of how climate contributes to wildfires, and then also the kind of emotional resonances of it. So it's been a really fun class because it's sort of new for me. And we're, thinking about a lot of different ways that communication around the environment can happen. Some, by artists that would be in museums, but also, people writing op-eds. And as our final projects, the students are doing creative projects, which is great. So I have students doing photo essays or podcasts, or one student is doing a song, and another student is doing like a musical theater piece. And so that's really interesting, to see them kind of translate these questions of like science and politics and justice into mediums that might be more accessible to broad audiences. I think one of the challenges with trying to do environmental communication is that people don't really want to spend that much time talking about it. I think there's a way in which these issues can feel very overwhelming, and so it's easier to just tune out. And I think that the arts or storytelling or podcasting or music can be ways of kind of drawing people into a conversation in a more expansive way, and that feels especially productive.
Well, I've experienced it myself. Just today I'm publishing one of my A Calm Presence newsletters. That's my at the end of every month I'm sharing the 5 things that I'm listening to that affect me the most. And the word affect is really the key to my experience, because I receive auditory information emotionally. And a lot of us do, right, through music, but in poetry. And then I become very moved by certain passages of a book or a podcast that I remember viscerally. Right? Intellectually, I go through it. But then there's another level of reception and retention in the body of stories. And I just wish that was better understood. Not just storytelling, but how we are affected by art and how it can lead us to change our ways. Because it's one thing to be aware. I'm aware that things are terrible. I wish I could do something. But then to translate that, receiving sensitivity or awareness into changing your own life, that's really what it's all about in the end.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful thing when that happens, right? It's then, these kind of vast abstractions of climate change, of global warming, of environmental justice, of pollution, it becomes something visceral and embodied. And then I think from there, from that moment of recognition, we can kind of move towards something like what Donna Haraway calls being responsible, but with response kind of being isolated, right? We have the ability to respond. That's a place that we can act from. And I do think that that's what the arts contribute to these discussions. There's that possibility of that kind of emotional or embodied connection to things that, and even as I think these questions of climate and environment come closer and closer to people's lives, right? We can think of the wildfire smoke here last summer, people experiencing, flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, drought in real time. But I think through storytelling or sound or visual media, we can really feel that on an embodied level. And I think that is a really powerful starting point to action.
Well, speaking of action, you're a writer of a book. I think I remember the title. I forget the title. Geologica, Camera Geologica, right?
That's it, yes.
Okay, so tell me about that, because it's coming out very soon, or it's out now, and it's in the next few weeks. What's the background on that? Why are you interested in this combination of photography and mineral extraction?
Camera Geologica sort of rethinks the history of photography from the perspective of the mine. When we talk about photography, of all of the sort of artistic mediums, it's the one that sort of promises immateriality. And it's very invested in these ideas of transparency, immediacy, the metaphors we use, window, mirror, lens. They'll promise a sort of dematerialization. And I think that that's something that we see, especially in the present moment, right? We think about digital images, the cloud, right? Everything stored in these kind of ephemeral things that sort of promise to liberate us from the sort of expenses and limitations of matter, or in the present moment, right? The sort of environmental impacts of matter. So I think it's this very seductive fantasy that runs throughout the history of image making. But if we think about the photograph itself, right, light is obviously a really vital component. It's in the name, photography, which means written with light. But the photographic print itself is always set in metals. In the vast majority of analog photographs, it's set in silver. When we chemically reduce silver to silver halides, they become light sensitive and they blacken when exposed to light. So that's what sort of forms the print itself.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, it hides in plain sight, right? It's in the name, silver gelatin print, okay. Platinum print. The materials are kind of always there, but the rhetoric or the discourse around photography really, I think, tries to move away from that materiality. So the kind of intention of Camera Geologica is to, I guess, look at the other half of the story, right? What other histories of photography can we open up if we think about the minerals that make it possible? And then if we're thinking about minerals, what we're thinking about is extraction, right? Silver, the sort of main material used in analog photography. By the 20th century, 25% of silver worldwide was being used in photography. So this is a major industry, right? This is very large scale. And I think that sort of restoring photography to these histories of extraction allows us to trace these complex chains of labor and environmental harms that make the image possible. And in a sense, right, it sort of uses the photograph as a sort of microcosm to understand society's relationship to extraction more broadly, right? Extraction builds our worlds. It's the shaping stuff that gives the world form. It lets us build our cities. It builds our infrastructure. In art, right, it allows us to express our hopes and dreams. So what extraction makes possible is really powerful, but the cost of doing it is very challenging. And so it sort of sits, the book is an attempt to sit in that complex place of implication. And, which myself, I don't place myself outside of that, right? I've been harmed by extraction, but I've also benefited from extraction. Extraction has made a lot of things in my life possible. Both
doing this podcast.
Exactly, yes, And so rather than saying, well, we're outside of it and we're critiquing it from this position that's removed, like really trying to get inside it and thinking about how we can understand these histories and trying to trace a longer sort of historical arc, right? Thinking about the sort of centuries of extraction and the ways that they've kind of contributed to ecological damage and climate crisis and kind of attendant histories of settler colonialism and environmental racism. And then the ways that artists have also mobilized and used photography as a tool to help us make sense of these processes or protest against those things. So really an attempt to sort of...
Full of contradictions.
Yes, there's so many tensions that run throughout the book, but I think that ambiguity or complexity is really important. And I think sometimes we can make the systems that we're critiquing too totalizing by only focusing on sort of one aspect of it, which I think when we're thinking about something like extraction or extractive capitalism, right, it's really important to think about how, corporations or governments or empires have kind of initiated these structural forms of damage and extracted and exploited, but also how people have resisted and the things that have been built out of that. So sitting in the complexity.
And then there's the illusion of sustainability that if we just, green things a little bit, we'll be able to continue, but we won't, because we will run out of materials, we will run out of energy, we'll run out of ecosystems. That's a harsh reality, but it's something that is happening now. And what I notice with artists is that they come at it from so many different angles, right? They have perspectives, sometimes they're personal, sometimes they're societal. There's the Edward Bertinskys of the world, and there's so many who contribute to this raising awareness, but that's not enough. And I feel that artists have skills that are underused in society, organizational skills, collaborative skills, cooperative abilities, that. So that's something that I'm interested in is how, in particular, young people are approaching the field of art now, knowing the realities that they will face as a generation and future generations, to be realistic and to be hopeful at the same time. What are your thoughts on that? You're a young person.
Oh, I mean, that is the question. I think, to go back to what you were saying earlier in the question, the sort of, this promise of sustainability, of green growth. The last chapter of the book turns to digital images to think about the sort of visual and extractive image economies of the present. And there's this really seductive fantasy that the world is becoming dematerialized. And I think the cloud is emblematic of this, right? We store our device, like all of our kind of documents are stored remotely. It's this sort of metaphor of something very untethered from Earth. And I was talking to a colleague recently, and they were saying that they'd gotten rid of printers in their institution to move towards sustainability, which, it does some action, but the sort of environmental cost of the digital is immense. But, devices have gotten smaller, so that allows us to think that they're less resource intensive when in fact they're actually more resource intensive. The metals have just gotten smaller. So rather than like bulkier plastic components, we have these like incredibly resource dense objects that are, they have incredible technological capabilities, but it comes at an incredible cost. And I think that, and I've learned about a lot of these histories through artist projects, right? Sort of highlighting the kind of many, many points of intersection of extraction, of environmental damage, of surveillance. And I think that, sometimes doing that tracing work can feel depressing. It's like, oh, there's so much that's wrong. We can't do anything. But I think it's actually the opposite, which is, we highlight all of these things as a way of opening up, right, all of these potential sites of change. And I think that knowledge is really empowering in that way. And I think sometimes when we're kind of given that data as like statistics or numbers or in a kind of the form of a report, it just feels too overwhelming. But I think that what artists do so powerfully is they can open up a history or a problem, but also show us how to see it differently, right? There's this possibility of broadening our perception or changing our perception or kind of, giving us this knowledge, but in a way that allows it to resonate somewhere else in our body or in our psyche, that I think can be a sort of entry point. And that question of hope, I think, is really important. I think politically, hope is necessary. It's not to say I'm optimistic. There's a lot of, teaching, right? It's sometimes hard to, teach the history of, kind of global climate organizing. It's like the Rio summit was in 1992, right? The sort of first world summit, the biggest diplomatic meeting in history around climate change, right? This is like a decade before any of my students were even born. And there's been no movement on it. Yeah, okay.
I was 32.
I was very young then. But, it's hard to be optimistic when I look at my students. And it's hard not to feel a certain degree of responsibility or shame. But I think that it's it's important to be clear-eyed when looking at the problem, but if we don't believe that things can change, then I feel like that's an abdication of responsibility that is, for someone who's grown up in Canada with all the privileges that I have, I feel like that is just a very irresponsible ethical position. So I'm invested in hope, and for that reason, again, I think artists can do some of that work in a way that feels vital and honest without. I think sometimes when we're coming at hope from an analytical place, it can feel a little bit like we're trying to feel that way, but we don't actually. We don't know how to get there in a certain lens. But I think that for myself personally, it's been the work of artists that's helped me see that other things might be possible.
Can you give us an example of an artist who you admire or who's inspiring to you as somebody with a practice in and around art and environmental issues?
The artistic practice that has been the most impactful for me, and it's the sort of focus of the first chapter of my book, which turns to bitumen, which was the light-sensitive material in the first photograph ever taken, right? It's basically tar. It's like a very tactile material. It's sort of interesting that it's the sort of primal scene of photography. But Warren Carreyrou, who's a professor at the University of Manitoba, and sort of from the tar sands region, he's Métis. He teaches Canadian literature and also writes. But he started making photographs of the tar sands about a decade ago, trying to sort of make sense of the changes to the landscape that he grew up in, and in a sort of, I guess, sense that maybe if people saw what was happening, they would understand it. But Warren's practice, it sort of replicates the kind of formula for the first ever photograph taken, Nicéphore Niepce's heliography process from the 1820s. And so Warren makes photographs with bitumen that he gathers from the tar sands, and it's very beautiful objects. They're kind of on mirrored surfaces, and bitumen, when it hardens, almost becomes gold. It's really quite lovely. But when you look at them, you're sort of immersed into the landscape because it's a reflective plate. And talking with Warren over the years and really thinking with his practice, I suppose taught me how to see those landscapes differently. And the sort of, I don't know, I guess ambiguous emotions that are raised when we think about things like the Athabasca tar sands and climate breakdown. There's these sort of fleeting moments of possibility that are very kind of embodied and physical when you look at those objects. And so, like, the book definitely wouldn't have existed in its current form without Warren's work, because that sort of shift from light to minerals was very much informed by thinking through and with his practice.
But because you've told the full story of the history of photography, in the sense of from its humble beginnings technologically, and that intertwined relationship between our practice and an industry, essentially, I find that really helpful. To know that story and to say, okay, well, look at the complexity here, look at the success, look at the tremendous devastation that it's caused, not just on the environment, but on people, on labor, and all kinds of things. So I invite people to read the book. I will when it comes out, and we can have further conversations about visual culture, because that's something that you teach. And I'm a sound guy, so I'm more of a sound culture guy, but I'm interested in how the codes are changing, and how what academics are interested in and around visual culture in relationship to the ecological crisis. Because anything that's not linked to the ecological crisis doesn't interest me too much. It does if it's really exciting or something, but seems to me, like you said a while ago, our responsibility is to live in this moment. And this is a very troubled moment on the planet. It still has a lot of potential, but the trouble is there. Like Donna Haraway sitting with the trouble idea is very much what we need to do, uncomfortable as it may be.
Yeah, I think that we're sort of definitely in many environmental turns, and that's kind of taking a lot of really interesting forms. And it seems like materiality and the sort of question of embodiment is something that is really kind of animating a lot of thought, both in the work that artists are doing, but also in the sort of questions that people are asking about, which I think is points to that, I think, desire to ground or ground these kind of vast conceptions and move them towards something more like embodiment, which feels interesting, right? Less kind of abstract questions of representation and really a move towards also community-based practice, right? Again, another way of sort of grounding things in place. And I think maybe one of the things that we can think about in terms of, how we build better worlds or imagine them is a sort of reorientation back to the local. I think the scale of the planetary is really productive in some ways, and obviously that shaped a lot of thinking around ecological crisis, but it can also be very challenging if we're thinking about the planetary and planetary solutions. So many people have to be on board to move the needle on those kind of questions, and that's very challenging for so many different reasons. But I think that if we kind of reorient these vast questions through and in local communities and local practices, in local ecosystems, there's some other possibilities that open up, and that allows us to sort of see all of the amazing work that's also already being done.
Well, I'm seeing the connections. Just this morning, I had a conversation with Sanita Fezic, and she's saying the same thing. Global thought and local action is not a new idea, but to be invested, and she's talking a lot about agriculture and peasant culture and how that is a tradition where people make their own food and share it and cooperate and that kind of thing. So I'm hearing that a lot, and I'm quite excited about the local and the community-based approaches because they're real. And
yes,
and we're here, and there are things that we need to do in our yards, in our communities, and have that bigger picture be brought to us by connectors. Like academics do that; they connect the dots between different theories, different ideas, and they teach younger people. So I'm finding that combination of groundedness, embodied work. I live here. I do things. I'm going to change what I can. And awareness and connecting the mental pieces or the networks of networks. I think the combination of those two is quite empowering because you can have that overview and get things done. Hopefully.
That's the goal.
Now, I want to end with a question I ask each of my guests. Is there a publication, a podcast, a book, or an artwork that you recommend that people access that you think would be helpful for them?
The book that has shifted my thinking the most since it came out, and every time I teach it, always this revelation moment in the classroom, is Max Liboiron's Pollution is Colonialism. It was published by Duke in, I think, 2021. But Max Liboiron runs clear laboratories at the university, at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and it's a sort of indigenous-led sort of marine plastics pollution research site. But it's an absolutely brilliant book. It's relatively short and very accessible, but it does really incredible connecting work between, plastics, petrochemicals, pollution, and settler colonialism and industrial capitalism. And it's a really, I think, powerful way of thinking through the very kind of complex histories that have led us to this moment of crisis. And then from there, right, it introduces a sort of different set of answers as to how we can move forward. So for me, absolutely kind of transformative in terms of my own thinking. And so I highly recommend it to everyone. It's also, I mean, it's just a very engaging read.
Right on. Well, thank you, Siobhan. It's been a pleasure to get to know you, to share some of your work, your good work, and we'll talk again.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.